My name is Matsumoto. Even though it's spelled R-A-Y, I am Japanese. I'm a Japanese citizen born and raised there. Um, these issues are very personally important to me because I feel a sense of responsibility as a Japanese person to confront these issues. And also my grandfather was Korean who moved to or immigrated to Japan before the war and eventually naturalized and became Japanese, and my Japanese grandmother. So this personal aspect is really important to the research that I do, and feel free to ask about it in the Q&A as well. So I wanted to include that before I begin my presentation. What I'll be talking about is the book I wrote during my fellowship at PAE during 2022-23, Echoes of Empire, the Power of Japanese Propaganda. So I guess to start off, when I first started this research, I guess kind of the first thing that came to my mind when it comes to Japanese propaganda was stuff like this. Of course, the one on my right, on your left, is an American propaganda poster depicting Japanese people, and on the left, it's a Japanese propaganda cover or poster depicting FDR during the Pacific War. I mean, these are the first things that came to my mind because, I think when thinking about propaganda, the first things that really pop up is very explicit forms of vilification, very straightforward, depicting the enemy as someone evil, whether if it's based on racial aspects or other aspects of war. These are kind of the first things that really popped into my mind when doing this research. But as I really started to dig deep into different kinds of Japanese propaganda, I started to really think deeply about the more subtle aspects of it. So not every time or not every effective form of propaganda is this explicit when it comes to vilifying the enemy. There are more subtle ways, in some ways more innocent ways, so to speak, that I think is kind of worth deeper research and analysis. So that's kind of the aspect that I'll be focusing on today. So, of course, the topic of Japanese propaganda is quite a broad issue, and there's a lot of questions that came to my mind when I first started to do this. And I mean, starting from these two examples, so the one on your right is from the Meiji period, back in 1895. It's a woodblock print piece depicting Captain Higuchi saving a Chinese girl during the first Sino-Japanese War. So this is one of the first or early forms of propaganda that I kind of looked into. And then one of the questions I had was, how did it really evolve up to 1945, until the end of the Pacific War? As you can see clearly, there's a very strong or very significant sort of modernization, so to speak, of the process or the evolution of propaganda. The first one, is a woodblock print. And the second one is one of the first animated films of Japan. And then, one of the first questions that came to my mind, apart from the fact that how did it change, was what were the things that remained the same? Because there are a lot of aspects that remain the same, especially in terms of content, ideology, ideas, that really kind of was preserved throughout the whole imperial period. Which in a way made it quite effective. So what are those aspects? At the same time, how did this change of kind of industrialization and modernization, so to speak, really impact the mediums of propaganda being created? And these are just two more drastic examples to kind of look into. And I'll be looking into this film more closely in the presentation. So this is just a very brief outline of the book. So I decided to kind of divide it up into different themes as opposed to something chronological, just because there's so much to kind of cover when it comes to Japanese propaganda. So I kind of used themes to kind of approach it, I guess, in terms of case studies instead of kind of trying to look at the whole aspect or the whole kind of continuum of what was going on. So these are the kind of the 4 themes / sections that I kind of divided it into. And if you have any questions about specific sections, feel free to ask in the Q&A. And I also wanted to lay out some main arguments that I kind of present. Of course, I don't have time to go through all of them, unfortunately, but these are some of the ones that kind of stick to me, or at least were kind of impactful for me when I finished this research. So one of the first things that I thought was really interesting was that there was no really centralized system of propaganda. So like a lot of people, during World War II, when they think of propaganda, maybe think of the Nazis, for instance. They had quite a pretty centralized system within the Nazi government, at least as opposed to Japan. Japan tried to create different ministries, a bunch of different agencies for propaganda, but none of them really sticked. And the one that really sticked, I guess, at the end was created in 1942. But at that point, there was already quite a large structure of propaganda that existed. And that agency just was created to kind of organize these different smaller organizations. Another aspect I guess I want to emphasize is that propaganda was very much intersectional. And what I mean by that is that it wasn't just about the military, it wasn't just about nationalism, it wasn't just about the emperor. It was very much kind of a hybrid of different ideas, ideologies, identities mixed together. So there were aspects of gender, race, of course, religion. I really want to emphasize how much this is kind of interwoven in different kinds of propaganda. But the 2 kind of arguments that I will focus on today is how, one, Japanese propaganda was quite an interesting mixture of modern and traditional ideas and mediums. And you can see that, for instance, in the previous slide of the picture of the film. I'll explain how that is in more detail. But and the second aspect that I'm going to emphasize in this presentation is how kind of innocent, in a way, or like innocent depictions really served to not just cover the violence that was going on in the war, but also really to normalize it. It really allowed regular Japanese people, so to speak, to kind of feel like this violence was acceptable or normal, or at least was kind of covered up in a way that made it really acceptable. And I'll elaborate what I mean by that. Okay, I'll very briefly go over this section. So when thinking about propaganda, arguably maybe you could say that education is something that supposedly opposes propaganda, something that teaches you to kind of resist it. But I argue in the book that the education system in Japan was something that really created the groundwork to allow propaganda to be very effective. And then I use one of a philosopher's or scholar's idea of pre-propaganda. It's something that makes propaganda not only effective, but it creates kind of a need for people to consume propaganda because they really they feel a desire for something righteous. They desire something to kind of create meaning in their life. And education, in a way, creates that groundwork, or at least that's what I argue in the book. And what came in tandem with education was this state Shinto aspect. So what state Shinto was, really simply speaking, is so after the Meiji Restoration, there was a law passed, or the Constitution passed, freedom of religion. So there was freedom of religion, technically speaking, but what they did was they made Shintoism not really a religion, but kind of an official religion, in the sense that they argued that it wasn't a religion, but it was something cultural. It was something significant for the culture of Japan. And why they did that was, according to Shinto legends, the emperor is a descendant of the god Amaterasu. So it creates it justifies the power and position of the emperor. And I argue that this was really important to establish this kind of pre-propagandistic structure that evolved throughout the war. So that's what I kind of mean by these two things. I don't have too much time to go into that much detail. If you have questions, please ask. But that's kind of what I mean by that. I'll briefly talk about this too. So one of the most interesting kinds of propaganda that I encountered was a story called The Three Human Bombers. So this is based on a story of three army soldiers, I believe, who committed a suicide mission in the Shanghai incident in 1932 that allowed the Japanese army to advance against the Chinese defense. And why this became so significant was that the education ministry and a bunch of other media outlets very much glorified what happened here. It became part of textbooks, it became part of official education, and they emphasized the significance of self-sacrifice through stories like The Three Human Bombers. And I think this really goes to the fact of how education creates this kind of need for these kind of stories. Self-sacrifice in war for Japan, despite kind of popular belief, wasn't actually that normal until like the Pacific War. It wasn't actually that common to, outright sacrifice your life in battle until later in the Pacific War. And these kind of stories made that normalized, especially for younger generations during the 1930s, and when they became older, they find the Pacific War, and then they internalized the idea that dying for the country became normal for them. At least that's what I argue in the book. And there's this really significant aspect about propaganda that I think is really important, is that it doesn't just create certain ideas in your head, it doesn't just indoctrinate what you think, but more importantly, it really creates action. I think that's a really significant part about propaganda. It forces you to take action in certain ways, and this is one really important or really significant aspect of it when it comes to violence, especially during the Pacific War. I hope that made sense. Okay, so another example of propaganda that really stuck to me was there was this film series during 1943, 1945 called Momotaro, the Sea Eagles, which was the first one, and Momotaro, the Sacred Sailors, which was the second one. So Momotaro is a very popular folk tale in Japan. It's told today, it's in a lot of different aspects of pop culture. But this is one of the examples of very innocent forms of propaganda. And what I mean by that is it creates kind of a soft, cute image of the war that really covers up the violence that's happening. And why that's effective is because it's very inclusive. Children very much would like this kind of medium of animation. And at the same time, it was also inclusive for adults as well. And this really kind of innocent form of propaganda, I argue, is really one of the more effective ways that Japan was able to normalize kind of ideas of violence, because they didn't confront the violence firsthand, but they understood the war through these kinds of forms of propaganda that really made it look like it was just very cutesy and very soft and very innocent, as opposed to the reality, which was very brutal and violent. And what's interesting about this is that, this is one important or good example of a mixture of tradition and modern when it comes to propaganda. So of course, the modern aspect is that it was the first animated film. It was actually based on like American films like cartoons like Disney, Looney Tunes, and Popeye. But at the same time, it incorporates traditional narratives, right? Because it uses Momotaro as an example or as a character, and it features that, and it pushes more traditional ideas of Japanese emperor-centrism, for instance, or different kinds of militaristic values. Sorry, I had a clip of this, but fortunately there's not a lot of time, so. Okay. Another thing I wanted to talk very briefly about, because I think this is really important today. So I touch upon in the conclusion of my book how the legacy of imperial Japanese propaganda lives on. And I use this example in part because it's a pretty straightforward example of how the legacy lives on today. Of course, it's a very complex process to argue how it lives on, but for simplicity, I talk about the Sanseito Party. If you don't know, the Sanseiyo Party is a very ultra-conservative party. It was only created in 2020, which is interesting because when I wrote it, they weren't that popular yet. They were gaining some popularity. But this year, they actually won 14 seats in the most recent election, which is very much kind of, in a sense, out of nowhere. It was a very significant win for them, which is quite concerning for a lot of people, or at least people like me from Japan. And I think they are a good example of how, one, I will argue that a lot of their content is a kind of propaganda. And it's a very modern form because they really use social media and online videos to push their narratives. But an example of how they actually use very similar content, similar ideas as to what was happening in Imperial Japan. Like to give I would like to show this clip from their website. So one of the main principles that they apparently push is a united Japan with the emperor at the center. To pursue the independence and prosperity of Japan and contribute to the development of humankind, to build a model for a harmonized Japan honoring the spirit and traditions of Japan. And well, I mean, the first time I heard that, I was quite shocked. It's very much a very similar rhetoric to what you will hear during Imperial Japan, but at the same time, it's very euphemized. And what I mean by that is it's kind of, it's phrased in a way that makes it sound like it's for Japanese people today, and it's not really trying to avoid the kind of violence that was happening during the war when emperor-centrism was kind of the model for Japanese politics. And even the example, or even the picture I had previously, I think is a really good example of how kind of they cover up their rhetoric of very racist, xenophobic, and very violent kind of ideas with this kind of cutesy kind of, images and political campaigning, so to speak. I think those aspects really parallel to what was happening in Imperial Japan. And if you're curious, I can talk about that in more detail as well. But that was just one example. Okay. To kind of conclude the presentation, I think one of the more important things that I came from this was, one, it was really important to think very closely about propaganda. I think one thing when you really study propaganda, it's kind of hard to really get a good grasp of kind of doing research on it because, the term propaganda has such kind of a weight to it, and it's kind of used as a derogatory term to kind of refer to things that you can kind of dismiss pretty easily. At the same time, it's really hard to understand what propaganda is as opposed to something that's an advertisement or something else. And the same thing goes for education as well. But I think the important aspect that I came away with this research is it's really important, one, to understand and analyze propaganda, but two, really to confront the violence that was happening during that time, to really understand what propaganda was trying to cover up, kind of euphemize, kind of make normal in Japan at the time. And I think these photos are a very good example of kind of the significance of confronting the reality that was happening in Japan during World War II. I mean, what people were seeing in Japan is on your left. You know, these kinds of photos, these kinds of mediums of propaganda, including films that really depict the military as something innocent, something brave, something good on your side, as opposed to the reality on your right, which is the very brutal violence that Japan was inflicting. I think it's really important to really confront, especially for someone like me who is Japanese, to confront that kind of violence firsthand or straight on, and not just kind of accept the kind of innocent propaganda that was spreading during that period. As someone who is Japanese, I feel a very strong responsibility to do that as well. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Can you talk about some of the differences between the themes that the Japanese use in the propaganda versus, say, the Nazis or the Allied powers?
That's a good question. I don't know as much about the Allied powers in Nazi Germany because it's not something I study too closely. But one thing I realized during the research was that there are a lot of different, so as you said, there are a lot of different themes in Japanese propaganda, at least, that was spreading. So the first one that I looked at was, I think this is more self-evident, but kind of glorifying the military. That was something very early on, especially in those woodblock prints, making the military look like some kind of brave, very glorious, and that kind of continue on in stuff like the three brave warriors or soldiers during the 1930s. But the more I think overshadowed themes that I thought was really interesting was one, the strong emphasis in kind of youth, and that's something, of course, that was common in Nazi Germany as well. Really not only depicting like children in propaganda, but really kind of focusing on them as kind of a target for propaganda. And two was depiction of women, whether if it's like motherhood or different aspects of like, so for instance, domestic propaganda in Japan really pushed ideas of kind of motherhood to the Japanese people, so-called kind of traditional ideas of self-sacrifice for the family, childbearing as well. But they also had a lot of propaganda depicting Western women in, like, for instance, leaflets in like the Philippines or different regions of the Pacific, which like overly sexualized them to make them seem like they were kind of base, so to speak. And I think that really goes in tandem with like the racial aspect as well of propaganda. So those at least are the four kind of themes that I looked into.
Were they claiming that China was going to attack Japan? Like, what did you find was the main, excuse they gave for invading China?
Unfortunately, I didn't.
Or like, what did they promote in the propaganda justifying the invasion?
Justifying the invasion, yeah.
At that time, yeah. Because often they'll say, oh, we're going to be attacked. I mean, in the U.S., we have had propaganda like, oh, Saddam has weapons of mass destruction.
Oh, I see.
I was wondering, like, what were they saying? Because China, I mean, we're not gonna attack Japan, but were they saying that, or?
I think the more common narrative that at least I saw was that it wasn't that there was so much a threat of China attacking Japan, but more the idea that Japan was kind of liberating people in China that kind of saved. Not sometimes communism as well, but also from the Kuomintang as well. Of course, like a lot of it wasn't very coherent as a narrative, which a lot of propaganda tends not to be. But that was kind of a common theme that I saw is kind of saving people in China, and especially when they depicted like Manchukuo propaganda, that was kind of the idea. That Japan will kind of create something liberating and prosperous for the people in Asia, including China, which kind of really advanced to Southeast Asia later in the war as well.
If there wasn't a centralized group promoting it, who was creating it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things I argue is that grassroots propaganda was really significant in Japan, or at least from what I saw. And what I mean by grassroots is they're not always like political organizations, but for instance, like Kamishibai, which is paper plays in Japan, that was a very common thing in like regular neighborhoods, where like an elderly man would kind of like tell stories in like parks and stuff using very like traditional looking paper plays. Of course, initially that was just a form of entertainment. It wasn't meant to be a kind of a form of propaganda per se. But as the war, or as like Japan imperialized, it eventually became more propagandistic in the sense that it was promoting certain narratives of like emperor-centrism or Japanese superiority. So that's kind of what I argue is that civilian propaganda was so significant. Because they quite willingly created forms of propaganda. And it wasn't always just kind of top down where the government was initiating the process.
Did the propaganda change when Japan started losing the war?
That's a good question. I think, I don't think it changed that significantly, but I mean, at least one thing that I saw a lot was, especially during the like near or the Pacific War and near the end of the Pacific War, they used a lot of leaflets in a lot of different regions, and again, what a lot of those leaflets depicted was a kind of like psychological warfare, where they would depict like wives cheating on their husbands, of course, like American wives cheating on American husbands to kind of create, or kind of to demoralize American troops to kind of surrender and give up on the war. That's something at least I saw more later on in the Pacific War as opposed to earlier on. And I don't know if that was in response to them losing per se, but at least that's at least one example that I saw pretty commonly near the end of the war.
I see that you put on a lot of propaganda on the Japanese during the Second World War. But right now, they are still going on as documented in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, they use proxy agent to slander Irish Chan's rape of Nanking and her personality. It's very bad, as written here with the American lawyer pointing out point by point and why Japanese government is still behind slander doing these things. Very bad. I hope you expose it.
I agree.
Thank you.
Yes, Jenny.
The high school students were talking about how anime were then used to be weaponized. So what's your post-war?
Oh.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, so basically the idea is that post-war, Japan wanted to soften its image and hide the war crimes.
Oh, I see.
So is there any connection with the anime, the use of anime to do that? Because they used it for World War II clearly, so it's kind of like
Yeah, I've seen that argument before, made pretty commonly. I apologize. It's not something I did a lot of research on. Whether it's like the directors themselves purposefully use that to cover up the past. But okay, there's two examples that kind of pop into my head. So first, I can't remember his name, but there's a very infamous right-wing writer in Japan who's, like for instance, he's very infamous for like denying the Nanjing massacre, the Confirmation issue, and interestingly, he writes manga to depict these. Like it has become very popular in Japan. There's a couple of his works, and that, for instance, is a very clear way of covering up, kind of softening up his ideas that Japan wasn't a violent country that didn't commit these atrocities by using manga as kind of a medium. His last name is Kobayashi. I can't remember his first name. Sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head. If you're curious, I can look it up later and share with you. But at least that's one example. And the other thing that came to my mind, which I thought was really interesting, and it doesn't directly answer your question, but there were a couple very famous directors who watched Momotaro during the war, and they became animators themselves. I forgot his name. The person who created, I think Miyazaki was one of them, and then the person who created him, Atomu, Atom Boy. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But what's interesting is that they supposedly really push anti-war ideas and messaging, but simultaneously they were inspired by propagandistic works at the end of the war. So it's something I couldn't really research in too much detail, but it's something to really think about, I think. Hope that was interesting.
If the propaganda was more bottom up, how
Mhm.
did they mass distribute the pieces of propaganda across the country?
That's a good question. So at least one of the forms that I saw was that, so in Japan, even from like earlier on, I guess, there were like neighborhood associations in a lot of the regions, which still exist today, by the way. And that was at least one way they were successfully spreading propaganda, I suppose. Of course, to them, they didn't think of it as propaganda, obviously. You know, it wasn't a propaganda campaign. But that was at least one way they were able to really successfully spread these ideas in these communities, because it's quite structured very well in a way. So when they would like meet in certain community meetings, they would spread propaganda, and then similar things happened in different regions of Japan as well. So at least that's one way that I saw propaganda spreading very effectively in civilian populations. Oh, yes.
The current situation, like the current, the Japanese people,
Yes.
what percentage of people are aware, like, oh, this was such a propaganda? I mean, or do they still believe?
That's always a hard question. I guess for the most part, they're not quite aware of, especially when it comes to propaganda as well. I mean, this film is actually pretty commonly known, and it's known in Japan to be a kind of propaganda during the war, at least this example. But I think when it comes to kind of broader aspects of propaganda, especially when it comes to like the legacies that live on, I think it's not quite well known, especially in my generation. It's not something that people really think about, or at least that's my personal experience, at least. Thank you very much.